Right here in the back of my truck, I have EcoFlow's brand new Wave 3. This is their new portable air conditioner and heater. It's basically a heat pump, and you can get heating or cooling out of a single device. Now last year I tested the Wave 2. This is an upgrade to that model. For example, this is now more powerful. It puts out more BTUs of cooling and more BTUs of heating. This now has insulated hoses, and my favorite thing is they've upgraded the battery to a lithium iron phosphate battery, or an LFP battery, that gives it more cycles over its lifetime and is safer to use. Now the Wave 3 and the Wave 2 are very similar in size. The Wave 3 is just taller because it has the add-on battery attached. Now in the first part of this video, we are going to put these head-to-head to see the differences in performance. Now after I test both of these units head-to-head, I then want to test the Wave 3 in the back of my truck as a truck camping setup to see how it works as an air conditioner and a heater. Let's jump into it. Now here on the table I have both the Wave 2 and the Wave 3, and I want to measure to see if there's any difference between these two models. I'm going to do that by tracking the power consumption. We're going to measure the airflow and also track the temperature output. So with the first test, I have both the Wave 2 and 3 in heat mode with the fan on the highest setting. This has been running for about 15 minutes. Let's check the power consumption numbers first. So looking at the power consumption of the Wave 2, it's around 560 watts. And looking at the power consumption of the Wave 3, it's around 590 watts. Next, I want to use my thermal camera to see if there's an actual difference in the temperature output between these models. Now up on the screen, you'll see the results. The Wave 3 put out 131.7 degrees Fahrenheit, and the Wave 2 put out 129.4 degrees Fahrenheit, so just a little bit warmer on the Wave 3. Next, I want to measure the CFM, or the cubic feet per minute, that's flowing out of each of the units. I'm getting around 950 CFM on the Wave 3. Now measuring the CFM on the Wave 2, we are seeing less airflow. It's around 800 CFM. So pretty interesting comparing these side by side in heat mode. The Wave 3 does pull more power, but it also puts out more heat and has more CFM. And since this is rated for more BTUs, we're basically seeing that when they're compared side by side. Now moving on to the next test, I've waited a couple hours for it to warm up, but now I have each one set in air conditioning mode. I also have them set to max mode. So let's let them run for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come in and measure the output to see how they differ. Now, as both of these have been running, I felt with my hand, and the Wave 3 definitely feels like it's putting out colder air and a lot more air. But let's go ahead and measure that. I have my thermal camera, so let's see the difference. So looking at the results, the Wave 2 was putting out 47.8 degrees, and the Wave 3 was putting out 40.3 degrees. So actually 7 degrees cooler air coming out of the Wave 3. Now what about the power usage on each one of these? On the left, we have the Wave 2, it's pulling 397 watts. On the right, it's the Wave 3, it's pulling a little bit more power at 425 watts. Now just a quick measurement of the CFM output on max mode. For the Wave 3, we are seeing a little bit over 1300 CFM. And measuring on the Wave 2, we're seeing a little bit over 1050 CFM. So after comparing these both head-to-head in heating mode and in air conditioning mode, it appears that the Wave 3 does have a larger compressor, and that's why it pulls a little bit more power. But the larger compressor allows it to have the cooler air in air conditioning mode and the warmer air in heating mode. And also I've noticed the increase in CFM on the Wave 3 versus the Wave 2, so it should allow better air circulation in the same space. Now let's go ahead and jump into some real-world testing with the Wave 3 in the back of my truck. So showing you the setup here, I do have the Wave 3. I've installed both of the insulated hoses going through this insulated foam board, so the air exchange is going through the outside. On the inside, I have a sleeping pad, and then right here in the middle of the camper shell, I have this temperature sensor hanging from the ceiling. It's exactly in the middle of everything. Now for the test today, it's going to be around 83 degrees, and I've put this in the sun just to simulate it kind of cooking up. Now that thermometer is showing 90 degrees right now. Of course, I've had this window open, so it's let a little bit of cooler air in there. But it was 90 degrees, so we'll see how much the Wave 3 can keep up with this. Now right here you can see both the inlet and outlet going through this insulated foam board, and I have that window slid open. So this should be a pretty good test to see how well the Wave 3 can cool down a space like this. Now I've just turned on the Wave 3 to air conditioning mode. I have the fan on full blast, but this is not running on max mode because I just want to see how long it'll run just on regular AC mode with the temperature set to 72 degrees. So like I said, it's around 90 degrees in here and this is set to 72, so can it hold that temperature? Now I've just shut the glass door and started the test. It is right at noon right now, so we'll see how long this goes. Now most people that are going to be running the Wave 3 are going to supplement it with solar panels, so I have a solar wire going out to some solar panels. So following that extension cable, these are the two solar panels I'm using for the test. These are EcoFlow's 125 watt bifacial solar panels. Now I've decided to use just two solar panels because not everyone has space for 400 plus watts of solar or the budget for that. So we'll see what 250 watts does during this test to extend the runtime on the Wave 3 battery. Okay, so the Wave 3 just shut off. Remember, we started the test at noon. It is now a little bit after 4 o'clock, so it ran for a little over 4 hours. Let's go ahead and take a look at the temperature results. Now up on the screen, you're gonna see two different temperature sensor readings because I used two during the test. One was on the outside top of the camper shell just to get an idea of how much heat was beating down on top of the camper shell. And then the right-hand side is the measurement inside the camper shell. So starting with the results on the left-hand side, we saw a peak of 112 degrees Fahrenheit and an average temperature of 107.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And remember, this is a white camper shell. Now, if we look at the actual results of the test on the right-hand side, the temperature was around 90 degrees when the test started at noon, and when the Wave 3 turned on, the temperature did drop down dramatically. We saw at the lowest temperature of 77.5, and then it gradually went up slightly above 80 degrees until the battery died and the Wave 3 shut off, and then you can see a spike in temperature. Now in the next test on the Wave 3, I wanted to test heat mode running off the standard battery with no charging input. Now this was a cooler day, it was around 50 degrees, so how long did it run and how effective was the heating? Now if we look at the results, we started with an internal temperature of 53 degrees, and as the Wave 3 turned on, we got all the way up to a peak temperature of 87.3 degrees, so it did heat up the space quite a bit. Now it ran for a total of 2.5 hours, actually a little bit longer than 2.5 hours, so that's what you'd expect running off the built-in battery on standard heating mode. Now the target temperature for this test was 80 degrees. It did get a little bit higher than that, and you can see the output temperature was 124 degrees, and it did sense the internal temperature around 89 degrees. This was at the middle of the test when the battery was still at 61% remaining. Now what's interesting to me when we compared this test versus the first test where we were charging with the 250 watts of solar, this test was much shorter because it just didn't have that extra power. So if you want a longer runtime, you're definitely going to need solar panels to extend that out. Now EcoFlow claims that you can get up to 8 hours of runtime off the attached battery, and for my testing, this is only going to happen if you have EcoMode enabled. So on a cold evening, I set the Wave 3 to heater mode with EcoMode enabled to see if it would get through the entire night and to see if it actually made a difference in temperature. Now up on the screen, you're going to see the results of that EcoMode test. On the far left, we have the ambient air temperature outside of the truck. In the middle, we have the temperature inside the truck. And then on the far right, we have the settings of the Wave 3. Now it actually almost ran for a full 8 hours. It ran from 10 p.m. almost to 6 a.m. And the coldest temperature, if you look on the left, got all the way down to 39.2 degrees. We started the test at about 53 degrees. Now, if you look at the temperature inside the truck, we only ever saw a difference of about 10 degrees higher than ambient. And so as it got colder, it also got colder in the back of the truck. And so it went from about 61 degrees peak all the way down to about, I'd say 46 degrees or so. So still very cold if you are trying to sleep in the back of that truck. Now this was on eco mode with the fan on the single mode setting or the lowest setting. So the trade-off with eco mode is that you do get a longer runtime and you do save a bit of power. However, the temperature difference might not be enough to keep you comfortable. So I have one other test that I want to do with the Wave 3 in the back of my truck, and I've changed up the setup quite a bit, so let me explain what I've done. So instead of running the Wave 3 off the attached battery, in this test I want to run it off the EcoFlow Delta 3 Plus. Now the biggest advantage here is this takes up to 1,000 watts input, where the attached battery only does 400 watts. Now it's forecasted to be around 85 degrees today, so it should be similar to our previous test. However, what I want to do is run this in air conditioning max mode to see if we can completely offset the power usage with the solar input and make a bigger difference inside the back of the truck, because during the last test it still got pretty warm in here. But if we're running this in max air conditioning mode, can it completely offset the heat in the back of the truck? Now I've just started the test. It's a little bit before noon. I have the Wave 3 running in max air conditioning mode with the set point at 60 degrees. So we'll see how close it can hold that temperature in the back of the truck. Now to offset the load of the air conditioner, I do have two different solar arrays connected up. This one right here is from EcoFlow. These are their bifacial panels. This equals 500 watts and it's connected into one of the solar charging ports. And then connected into the second charging port on the Delta 3 Plus is this Zoop W 450 watt panel. Both of those cables are going over to the truck. Now with both of those solar arrays connected into the power station, we were getting over 800 watts input, and this was still 2 hours away from peak solar. Now with this amount of charging, we were able to keep the power station full and run the Wave 3 on max air conditioning mode. So let's look at the results of the test. On the left-hand side, you see the settings for the Wave 3. We had cooling mode enabled. It was also in max mode. Target temperature of 60 degrees. The air output at the time of the screenshot was 51 degrees. The ambient temperature inside the truck cab was 77. You can see at the top that the battery was fully charged. Now there are two other graphs here on the screen. The center graph is the ambient temperature outside the truck. The far right graph is the temperature inside the truck cab as the Wave 3 was running. Well, how long did the Wave 3 actually run? Well, we started the test a little bit before noon, and the Delta 3 Plus battery died a little after 8 p.m., so it ran for about 8.5 hours. Now let's compare the difference in temperature on the outside versus the inside. Now we measured a peak temperature of 107 degrees and an average of about 90 degrees. Now remember, it was about 85 degrees during the day, so there's just a little bit more heat on the actual truck shell. Now, looking at the temperature on the inside of the truck shell while the Wave 3 was running, we saw a peak of 84 degrees before the test started, and then the temperature dropped down pretty quick and it averaged out around 72 degrees. Now, I'm not sure if you guys noticed the temperature dip on both of these charts, but that's actually where we had some cloud cover for about 15 minutes. So I was surprised that it affected the temperature that much. It also allowed the power station to drop down and stay charged because we didn't have much solar to keep it going. But luckily the sun came back out and it started to charge back up again. Now comparing these results to the previous test, it's definitely more effective to run the Wave 3 in max air conditioning mode, but just keep in mind you will have to have a decent amount of solar to get a long run time. Now I also had to move my solar panels around the yard throughout the day in order to keep the best charging input. And as the sun started going down, I was getting a bunch of shade on the solar panels, and eventually once the sun set, I wasn't getting any charging input and the power station eventually died. Now after all my testing with the Wave 3, I think it's fair to say that you get the best performance when it's set to max mode, whether that's in heating or cooling. And most environments are probably going to require max mode if you're going to be comfortable. The problem with setting it to max mode is that it eats the battery really fast. So it would be cool if they offered a larger battery or offered a higher solar input. For example, when this is running in max mode, I saw up to 550 watts. And because this only allows 400 watts of solar input, you can't completely offset the power usage. It'd be really cool if you could completely offset the power usage with solar panels. The other thing that you could do is connect this up to a larger power station and run it off the AC inverter of that power station so that the larger power station can take in more of the solar as needed, and then this just runs completely off solar power. Now, are you going to bring a large power station with you in a portable setup like this, like in the back of a truck camper? Probably not. So the use cases on the Wave 3 are definitely interesting. You guys will have to let me know what you think about the Wave 3 and its performance down in the comment section. Now, what about the pricing on the EcoFlow Wave 3? If you look at their website, it has an MSRP of $12.99, but it's actually on sale for $8.99 right now. And EcoFlow has also provided an additional discount code for my viewers to drop the price $45 or 5%. Now also check out the bundles listed below. You can see that the Wave 3 plus the add-on battery is the same price as the Wave 3 plus the Delta 3 Plus. So I'd recommend going with the Delta 3 Plus bundle because it's an entire power station and you get much more usability. You also get up to 1,000 watts input on the Delta 3 Plus, so you could technically offset the Wave 3 power usage throughout the entire day if you had decent solar. Now guys, thank you so much for watching. I will have a link to this product down in the video description along with my full review on the Wave 2 so you can see how they differ. Until next time, we'll see you guys later.